Good morning. Today we'll be studying in depth about respiration, on how respiration occurs on a microscopic level. Initially, we basically covered respiration just superficially for no levels. So now we'll cover it in detail. Now the properties for efficient respiration are that there should be essentially a large surface area to volume ratio. How do we basically maintain a large surface area to volume ratio? Well, as we know that diffusion occurs from an area of high concentration to low in area of low concentration. Now, obviously, if the distance will be minimized, the diffusion will be more efficient. So we need to know that the walls of alveoli have a distance of 1 millimeter of less or less. Similarly, they are supplied by a large amount of capillaries which supply with them with a large amount of blood supply. And similarly, there is an adequate ventilation PQ or ventilation perfusion ratio. These are the important properties listed from the above, which need to be basically conceptualized. Now, the basic anatomy of the airways has been described. We all know that there are two nostrils and the bronchi. Yeah, you should know that the bronchi are further divided into bronchioles, and the bronchioles are lastly divided into the alveoli. And if they're asked in the exam that what is the functional unit of respiration, it is always the alveoli. Okay, because respiration occurs on a microscopic level on the in the alveoli. Now, if we talk about the lungs anatomy, you should know that the mediastinum is the thing which basically separates the two lungs, the right and the left, and it is the area between the two. And apart from that, the lungs are basically covered by a thin membranous layer called pleura. Now, what is the surfactant? A surfactant is a mixture of lipoproteins which forms a layer of fluid or in the alveoli to help to reduce the overall surface tension of them. By helping to reduce the surface tension, it also speeds up the transport of respiratory gases and helps to kill the bacteria. So there is a syndrome referred to as the respiratory distress syndrome. It occurs in infants who are less than 7 months of age. In these children, they suffer from respiratory distress syndrome because of a lack of surfactant, and thus, what is the primary role of surfactant, if they ask you, is to reduce the surface tension. Since the surface tension hasn't been reduced, so there isn't an efficient diffusion of gases. Now, if we talk about how breathing occurs, we need to know that breathing is basically an involuntary action. And in a normal human being breathes about 15 to 20 times per minute, which can be increased in cases of exercise. Now, if we talk about the differences between inspiration and expiration, although already told you what the changes which occur in inspiration and expiration in the previous video and the important mnemonics which will help you to memorize, the difference between the two can be that you should know that what happens to the status of the diaphragm. In inspiration, the diaphragm contracts and become less dome shaped. In expiration, the diaphragm relaxes and becomes more dome shaped. Naturally, inspiration would lead to an increase in volume since air is being inhaled, whereas in expiration, air is being exhaled. Now, if we talk about this, is all just you need to give a reading, and yeah, the important thing listed over here is that you need to know that the principal nerve supply of the diaphragm is supplied by the phrenic nerve, and the phrenic nerve is the nerve which is irritated, which is responsible for the involuntary hiccups which a person has. Now we talk about the transport of gases. We all know that oxygen is transported in the form of oxyhemoglobin. 97% of oxygen is transported in the form of oxyhemoglobin. And oxygen diffusion to the tissues is a primary responsibility, or I would say a primary target of basically transporting oxygen in the form of oxyhemoglobin. Now, if we talk about the dissociation of oxyhemoglobin from red blood cells, which store 97% of the oxygen, it is directly proportional to the oxygen carrying capacity and the need of the tissue. And you just give a reading to these facts that the maximum capacity of hemoglobin is 20 ml per 100 ml of blood. So as basically the partial pressure decreases below 60, there is a maximum dissociation of oxygen from the oxyhemoglobin. The factors which affect the holding capacity of hemoglobin are CO2, because when a person becomes more and more apneic and the carbon dioxide level increases in his body, he has an increased urge to exchange more and more of CO2 out of the body. So the breathing process is basically increased, and thus the oxygen dissociation from the red blood cells increases to the tissue, which would die from hypoxia if they aren't supplied with oxygen in a very quick amount of time. Next comes temperature. Temperature also increases the dissociation of oxygen from the oxyhemoglobin. And the last factor is pH. So you need to know these three factors: CO2, temperature, and pH. With the fall in temperature, the oxygen bind to has been bound to hemoglobin declines, and thus you need to know that acidity or acidic pH of blood promotes the dissociation of oxygen from the blood. Now we come to CO2. As we already know, that CO2 is a far more important stimulant than oxygen in controlling breathing rate. Now we'll basically study about the transport of CO2. Carbon dioxide is primarily transported in the blood in the form of bicarbonate ions and in minor quantities and found in the form of carboxyhemoglobin or carbaminohemoglobin, and also in the form of in the blood plasma it is dissolved. Now I'm just skipping out the facts which are irrelevant to the topic or are simply require memorization. So as we studied earlier, the formation of oxyhemoglobin, how does carboxyhemoglobin form? Carboxyhemoglobin form when the CO2 basically combines with the amino group of the hemoglobin, which is a part of the hemoglobin. If you talk about the capacity of blood for CO2, arterial blood contains 50 ml of CO2, whereas venous blood obviously contains more CO2 than the arterial blood, since we all know that the venous blood is deoxygenated. Lastly, as we come to the end of the chapter, we should know the primary differences between hemoglobin and myoglobin. Myoglobin primarily stores oxygen in the muscles, and it has more storage affinity than hemoglobin. As we can see over here, that the affinity with oxygen is more for hemoglobin. However, the important difference is the capacity to store more oxygen. Hemoglobin has it more. And similarly, myoglobin, as we studied earlier as well, that from hemoglobin, oxygen dissociates at partial pressure oxygen of C60. However, in the case of myoglobin, it dissociates at extremely low levels of partial pressure, which are 20. Apart from that, hemoglobin has a quaternary structure and it has four polypeptide chains linked with each other. However, myoglobin has tertiary structure and it has only one polypeptide chain which has been linked. Now we come to the other definitions. The total lung capacity, which in a normal lung can hold when totally inflated, is 5 to 6 liters, and the amount of air which is inhaled or exhaled in a single breath is about 500 ml. What is the inspiratory reserve volume? Inspiratory reserve volume is 3000 ml. And what is it? It is when normally a person inspires, it takes about a specific amount of breath into him. However, the extra amount which he inhales afterwards, that is known as the inspiratory reserve volume. Now we'll talk about some of the main respiratory disorders. We've talked about TB extensively previously as well, so I'll not be talking about it. However, I'll just tell you that TB is more prevalent in the developing countries of the world where the socioeconomic conditions are not so good. It is an infectious disorder and it spreads by the bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Apart from that, emphysema is very important. It it is caused by smoking. Smoking is the 99% cause of emphysema. And what does emphysema occur? It occurs because there is a breakdown of alveoli, and alveoli, as we all know, that are involved in the gaseous exchange of gases. Due to decreased gaseous exchange of gases, a person develops breathlessness and exhaustion. And the cardinal signs which a person can see are inability to climb up the stairs, or that person can be easily caught catching his breath when he does extensive labor work. Now, what does smoke do? Smoke and nicotine and other irritant particles, they basically irritate the path airway of the human, and due to excessive coughing, which occurs in the case of smokers. They further weaken the alveoli and decrease the absorptive surface area, which is involved in gaseous exchange. In the case of cancer, you need to know that lung cancer is the number one cause of death in the world. Why? Because unlike other cancers, which can be detected at an earlier stage, lung cancer does not show any symptoms until a very late stage, and by that stage, it has already metastasized to all other parts of the body. Now, 90%, as as we'll be talking about later as well, that smoking is responsible for 90% of all the airway disorders and respiratory disorders. In the case of cancer, it is a malignant tumor which expands by metastasis and occludes the respiratory passages. The only treatment is chemotherapy after it has developed, and there are very less chances of survival. Thank you.